He traveled from Spain to visit his online GF. He saw she was a conjoined twin. She deceived him. The screen glowed softly in the darkened Madrid apartment, casting blue light across Mateo's face as he typed another message. His fingers moved with practiced urgency, the kind that comes from months of repetition, from conversations that stretch deep into the night when the rest of the world sleeps. On the other side of the ocean, in a small Connecticut town he'd never heard of until 6 months ago, Emma was awake too. She always was. Their time zones had become synchronized through sheer force of longing, through the electric pull of something neither could name but both desperately needed. "I want to see you," Mateo typed, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Really see you. Not through a screen." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. He held his breath. "You don't know what you're asking," came her response. "Some things are better left in the imagination." But imagination was no longer enough. Mateo had spent 29 years building a life that looked perfect from the outside, a successful career in digital marketing, a sunlit apartment overlooking the Retiro Park, friends who envied his freedom. Yet every night he found himself returning to that glowing screen, to Emma's words that seemed to understand the hollow spaces inside him that no amount of success could fill. She wrote about loneliness like someone who had mapped its every contour. She understood his fear of intimacy, his pattern of leaving before he could be left. She never pushed, never demanded, never asked for anything except his honesty. And now he was asking for hers. "Then let me decide what I can handle," he wrote back. "I'm booking a flight." The silence that followed lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. He counted them. "Okay," she finally replied. "But when you see me, don't say I didn't warn you." Mateo stared at those words for a long time, trying to decode their weight. He'd seen her face in photographs, only twice, and both times partially obscured, a profile shot in golden hour light, another from behind as she stood before the ocean. She claimed the camera made her anxious, that she'd been bullied in high school for her appearance, that she was working through trauma with a therapist. He'd accepted these explanations because he wanted to believe in the person behind the words more than he needed to see the face that spoke them. Now, as he clicked through flight options, a small voice whispered warnings he refused to hear. The plane touched down at Bradley International Airport on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. The New England autumn was in full display, trees burning with colors Mateo had only seen in paintings, deep crimsons and golds that seemed almost violent against the gray sky. He'd packed light, just a carry-on with a week's worth of clothes and a bottle of Spanish wine he'd spent too much money on, wanting to arrive with something that spoke of home, of the place he was leaving behind to meet her. She'd offered to pick him up, but he'd declined, sensing her nervousness through the careful spacing of her messages. Instead, he rented a car and drove the 45 minutes to Fairfield, following GP's directions through winding roads that cut through forests so thick they seemed to swallow the afternoon light. The rental car smelled of synthetic pine and previous travelers' regrets. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Emma had given him an address, a Victorian house on the edge of town, surrounded by oaks that had probably stood for a century. The house itself seemed to lean slightly to one side, its paint the color of old pearls, shutters hanging at angles that suggested gentle decay. It was the kind of place that held secrets in its walls, that absorbed the lives lived within it until it became more memory than structure. Mateo parked on the street and sat in the car for 5 full minutes, watching the house for signs of movement. His phone buzzed. "I can see you," Emma's message read. "It's okay. Come in." The front doors unlocked. He looked up at the second-floor windows, but saw only reflections of clouds and bare branches. Taking a breath that felt too shallow, he grabbed his bag and walked up the path lined with overgrown hydrangeas, their dried blooms rattling in the November wind. The door opened before he could knock. She stood in the doorway, and for a moment, Mateo's brain struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. Emma was beautiful, more so than her photographs had suggested. High cheekbones, dark eyes that held galaxies of intelligence and pain, hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. But she wasn't alone. Connected to her right side, sharing her body from the ribcage down, was another woman. Same dark hair, same delicate features, but with eyes that assessed him with an entirely different energy, harder, more guarded, tinged with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "This is Clara," Emma said softly, her voice the same one he'd heard in countless voice messages, made flesh and more fragile than he'd imagined. "My sister. My twin. My—" She trailed off, searching for words that didn't exist. "We're conjoined. I'm sorry I didn't tell you." I couldn't find a way to say it that didn't sound like a confession or an apology, and I didn't want our beginning to be either of those things. Matteo stood frozen on the doorstep, his romantic fantasies colliding with a reality far more complex than anything his imagination had prepared him for. Clara's eyes never left his face, reading every micro-expression with the expertise of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching people's faces change when they understood. "You can leave," Clara said, her voice harder than Emma's, shaped by different experiences of the same life. "Most people do. It's easier than pretending you're fine with something you're not." But Matteo didn't leave. Instead, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into a world he didn't understand but found himself unable to turn away from. The house smelled of lavender and old books, of lives lived in careful proximity to one another. Emma's face flooded with relief, with something that looked like hope, trying desperately not to hope too much. "Come in," she whispered. "Let me explain everything." The explanation came in pieces over cups of tea that grew cold while Emma spoke. They sat in a living room crowded with mismatched furniture and medical equipment, partially hidden behind decorative screens, a wheelchair, oxygen tanks, devices whose purposes Matteo couldn't begin to guess. Clara mostly stayed silent, her presence a constant weight at Emma's side, her eyes moving between Matteo and her sister with an expression he couldn't quite read. They were dicephalic parapagus twins, Emma explained, meaning they had two heads but shared one body from the shoulders down. They controlled different sides, Emma the right, Clara the left. Every movement required negotiation, cooperation, a lifetime of learning to exist as two minds in a shared physical space. Most conjoined twins like them didn't survive past childhood, but Emma and Clara had beaten the odds, had made it to 27 years through a combination of excellent medical care and sheer stubborn will. "I wanted to tell you," Emma said, her fingers twisting together in her lap, a gesture Matteo recognized from their video calls, the few times she'd allowed the camera to focus on her hands. "Every day I wanted to tell you. But I was terrified that if you knew, you'd see me differently, that I'd become a medical condition instead of a person, and for 6 months talking to you, I got to just be Emma. Just a woman who liked the same obscure poetry and terrible horror movies and late-night philosophical conversations as you. I wasn't the conjoined twin, I was just me." "You were never just you," Clara interjected, her voice sharp with years of unspoken resentments. "You can't have a relationship without me being part of it. You can't have anything without me." And he needed to know that from the beginning, the tension between the sisters was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Matteo watched Emma's face crumple slightly, watched her swallow down words she'd probably spoken 1,000 times before in 1,000 similar arguments. He began to understand that the relationship he'd been building for 6 months was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Not just because of the physical reality, but because Emma came with a built-in witness to every moment, every intimacy, every private thought shared between them. "I understand if you want to leave," Emma said again, echoing Clara's earlier words. "I understand if this is too much. I needed you to know me first. Before you knew this." Matteo looked at her, at them, and felt something shift inside his chest. Yes, he was shocked. Yes, his mind was racing with questions and concerns and a dawning realization of how different this would be from any relationship he'd ever known. But he was also seeing Emma, really seeing her, for the first time. The vulnerability in her eyes, the courage it must have taken to invite him here knowing he might flee, the months of hiding not out of malice, but out of a desperate desire to be seen as human, before being seen as different. "I'm not leaving," he heard himself say. "Not yet. Let me just process this. Let me get to know both of you. The real you. Not the screen version. Emma's face transformed, tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded rapidly. Clara's expression remained skeptical, but something in her eyes softened fractionally, as if she was cautiously willing to let him try. What Matteo didn't understand yet, what he wouldn't understand until it was far too late, was that he'd just agreed to enter a psychological maze from which there might be no exit. That the deception wasn't about the body they shared, but about the darker truths still hidden beneath Emma's carefully constructed vulnerability. The first 3 days passed in a strange bubble of domesticity tinged with constant revelation. Matteo stayed at a hotel, but spent his days at the house, learning the rhythms of Emma and Clara's life. He watched them navigate their shared existence with a choreography born of necessity, how they moved through doorways, how they ate separately but simultaneously, their individual preferences honored despite the shared digestive system, how they argued over television shows with the ease of people who'd been having the same argument for decades. Emma was everything she'd been online, thoughtful, curious, emotionally intelligent. She asked questions about his childhood in Barcelona, about his estranged relationship with his father, about the dreams he'd abandoned to pursue the safer path of corporate success. She remembered every detail he'd ever shared, could reference conversations from months ago with perfect accuracy. Being with her felt like being truly seen for the first time in his life. Clara was different, sharper, more cynical, quicker to anger but also quicker to laugh at dark jokes Emma would never make. She was studying astrophysics through online courses, working on theories about dark matter that Matteo couldn't begin to understand. She painted abstract canvases that lined the walls, violent swirls of color that seemed to express emotions too large for words. Where Emma wanted to understand people, Clara seemed to want to understand anything but people. "She's always been the dreamer," Clara said on the 3rd day, when Emma had fallen asleep during a movie and Matteo was left sitting with Clara's sharp awareness. "Even when we were kids, she believed in fairy tales. I was the one who understood that our life would never be normal, never be easy. I made peace with it. Emma never has." "Is that why you didn't want her to tell me?" Matteo asked carefully. Clara's laugh was bitter. "I didn't want her to tell you because I knew what would happen. She'd fall in love with the idea of being normal, of having a boyfriend who lived across an ocean and could imagine her however he wanted. And then, when reality hit, it would break her. It always does. This isn't our first rodeo, Matteo. You're not the first man who's been interested in Emma." Something cold settled in Matteo's stomach. "What happened to the others?" "They left, usually within days. One lasted almost 3 weeks before he admitted he couldn't handle it." "Couldn't handle me." Clara's eyes fixed on him with laser intensity. "Because that's what this is really about. You think you're okay with this, but you're not okay with me. You're okay with Emma having a complicated medical condition. You're not okay with the fact that if you kiss her, I feel it. If you touch her, I'm there. If you fuck her, which is what you're really thinking about, isn't it? I'm not going anywhere." "Clara, that's enough." Emma's voice cut through the tension. She was awake, had been awake, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "No, she's right," Matteo said quietly. "I haven't figured out how this works. I'm trying, but I don't have the answers yet. I'm still processing. Take all the time you need," Emma said softly. "But please, be honest with me. If you realize this isn't what you want, tell me. Don't just disappear." He promised he wouldn't. It was the first lie he told her, though he didn't know it yet. On the 4th day, things shifted. Emma suggested they go out, leave the house that had become both sanctuary and prison. There was a park nearby, she said, with walking trails that were accessible. She wanted Matteo to see more of their town, more of the life they'd built despite the limitations. They went in the afternoon, the November air crisp enough to burn the lungs. Emma and Clara moved with surprising grace in their wheelchair, their practiced coordination making the device an extension rather than a limitation. Matteo walked beside them, pushing when the path inclined, stepping back when they wanted to propel themselves. Other people stared. Some were subtle about it, glancing and quickly looking away. Others were more blatant, children pointing before parents shushed them with horrified whispers. Emma seemed used to it, her face composed in a mask of deliberate serenity. But Clara met every stare with direct eye contact, challenging, daring people to say something. "Does it ever stop bothering you?" Matteo asked. "Which part?" Emma replied. "The staring, or the fact that we've given people permission to make our bodies a public conversation? I meant the loss of privacy. Having everyone's eyes on you." "Privacy," Clara said, her voice thick with irony, "is something we've never had. Not from the world, not from each other. You get used to living in a fishbowl. Or you don't, and you lose your mind. There's no middle ground." They stopped at a pond where ducks clustered, hoping for bread no one had brought. The water reflected the gray sky, making it impossible to tell where the world ended and its mirror image began. Emma grew quiet, her eyes distant. "What are you thinking?" Matteo asked, crouching beside the wheelchair. "That I wish I could give you something simple," Emma said. "A normal relationship, dates where we blend into the background, intimacy without an audience, the chance to get to know just me, without the complexity of us." "But that's not reality," Clara added, her voice gentler than usual. "And pretending it only makes everything harder." Matteo reached out and took Emma's hand, the gesture feeling simultaneously natural and performative, aware of the public nature of their affection. Her fingers laced through his, warm despite the cold. He felt Clara shift beside her, felt the interconnected reality of touching one while being observed by the other. "I want to try," he said. "I know it's complicated. I know I don't understand everything yet. But I want to try." Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her face with hope. Clara's expression remained inscrutable, but she didn't pull away, didn't voice another objection. In that moment, by the pond with its mirror surface, Matteo believed his own words. He believed he could navigate this complexity, could separate his feelings for Emma from his discomfort with their situation. He didn't yet understand that Emma's deception wasn't about her body. That revelation was still waiting, coiled in the shadows of the Victorian house, ready to strike. It started with small inconsistencies. On the 5th day, Matteo's laptop ran out of battery, and Emma offered to let him use hers to check his work emails. He logged into his account, cleared his inbox, and was about to close the browser when he noticed Emma's email was still open in another tab. He shouldn't have looked. He knew it was a violation. But curiosity, or perhaps some instinct he couldn't name, made him glance at the inbox preview. His own name appeared multiple times in the subject lines, but these weren't messages they'd sent to each other. These were emails from Emma to someone else, dated throughout the past 6 months, describing her relationship experiment with Matteo. Describing him. His hands started shaking as he clicked into one of the messages. "The Spanish guy is still completely invested," Emma had written 3 weeks ago. "I haven't told him yet. Every day I plan to, and every day I lose my nerve. Clara says I'm being cruel, that I'm playing with him, but she doesn't understand. This might be my only chance to experience romance the way normal people do. To have someone fall in love with my mind first, with who I am, before what I am. Is that so wrong? Is it manipulation if it comes from desperate longing rather than malice?" Matteo scrolled frantically, finding more messages, each one unraveling his understanding further. The emails were addressed to someone named Dr. Rachel Vance, Emma's therapist, he realized. But these weren't typical therapy updates. These read like journal entries, like confessions, like the writings of someone constructing and deconstructing their own elaborate psychological experiment. "I know I should tell him about Michael," another email read, dated just days before Matteo's arrival. "But if he knows there was someone before him, someone who lasted longer, someone who left anyway, he'll understand that this is a pattern, that I'm a pattern." Clara calls it my compulsion, falling in love with men online, building these elaborate emotional connections, and then revealing myself and watching the whole thing implode. She says I'm addicted to the heartbreak, that I'm recreating our parents' abandonment over and over, trying to control the outcome. Maybe she's right. Maybe that's why I haven't told Matteo about Michael's suicide. How do you tell someone that your last boyfriend killed himself 6 weeks after meeting you? How do you explain that the reality of us was so overwhelming that he drove his car into a tree rather than figure out how to leave without destroying me? Mateo's vision blurred. His hands were numb. The laptop screen swam with words he couldn't quite process. There was more. So much more. Emails describing other men, at least 4 before Michael, each relationship following the same pattern. Months of online intimacy, then an invitation to meet, then the revelation, then varying degrees of disaster. One man had fled in the middle of the night. Another had tried to stay, but ended up in therapy himself, having a breakdown when he realized he'd developed feelings for Clara instead of Emma. Another had threatened legal action, claiming he'd been emotionally manipulated and deceived. And through it all, Emma's words swung between genuine remorse and something darker. A fascination with her own power to create and destroy these relationships, to watch men struggle with the complexity she represented, to test the limits of their proclaimed love. Mateo is different, one of the most recent emails read. I can feel it. He has his own wounds, his own patterns of avoidance. Maybe that makes him more capable of understanding. Or maybe it just makes him a better target. I don't know anymore. I don't know if what I'm doing is trying to find love or trying to prove it doesn't exist. Not for someone like me. The front door opened downstairs. Emma and Clara were returning from the small garden where they'd gone while he worked. He had maybe 90 seconds before they came upstairs. Mateo closed the browser with shaking hands, his mind racing. Every conversation they'd had replayed itself with new context. Every vulnerable confession Emma had shared suddenly seemed like a calculated move in a game he hadn't known they were playing. The romantic connection he'd felt, the sense of being uniquely seen and understood, had any of it been real? Or was he just the latest subject in Emma's ongoing experiment in disappointment? Mateo? Emma's voice drifted up the stairs. Are you hungry? We were thinking of ordering dinner. He forced his voice steady. Yeah, sure, whatever you want, but nothing would be the same. The foundation had cracked, and he didn't know if it could be repaired or if it had ever been solid to begin with. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, Mateo spent the next 2 days watching Emma with new eyes, searching for signs of the manipulation he'd read about in her emails. Every sweet gesture now carried a question mark. Every vulnerable moment seemed potentially performative. When she spoke about her feelings for him, he found himself analyzing her word choices, looking for the seams in her presentation. Clara noticed the change first. You found something, she said on the 7th day, when Emma was napping and Mateo was standing by the window, staring out at the oak trees without really seeing them. It wasn't a question. Her emails, Mateo confirmed quietly. To her therapist. About me. About the others. Clara was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of resignation he hadn't heard before. Michael? Among others. She didn't kill Michael, Clara said firmly. I need you to understand that. What he did was his choice. He was sick long before he met us, had been struggling with depression since adolescence. Emma blames herself, but it's not fair, and it's not accurate. But there were others. Multiple others. Following the same pattern, building relationships online, hiding the truth, then watching them fall apart. Yes, Clara admitted. There were others. And yes, it's a pattern, but you need to understand the context. Our whole lives, Emma and I have been treated like a medical curiosity, like a tragedy, like something to be studied or pitied but never truly loved. Every relationship we've had, friendships, potential romances, has been colored by our condition. People can't see past it. So Emma found a way to be seen first, to be known for her mind and her personality before her body becomes the defining feature. Is that manipulation? Or is it just survival? She lied to me, Mateo said, his voice harder than he intended. She omitted information. That's different. Is it, when the information is this significant? Clara's eyes flashed with anger. You're standing here in judgment like you've never hidden parts of yourself to make yourself more palatable. Like you didn't spend 6 months presenting a curated version of your life to her. Did you tell her about the engagement you broke off 3 years ago because you were terrified of commitment? Did you mention the pattern of relationships you sabotage the moment they get serious? We all hide, Mateo. Emma just has more to hide. He turned to face her fully. The difference is that my omissions don't lead to people killing themselves. The slap would have been physical if Clara could have moved independently. Instead, it landed as words. Get out. If you're going to reduce Michael's death to a weapon against her, then get out. You're not as different from the others as she hoped. Clara, stop. Emma was awake, had been awake for who knows how long. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. He's right. I should have told him. I should have told him everything from the beginning. I wanted one thing in my life that wasn't defined by this body, by this condition, by the tragedy that everyone sees when they look at us. Emma, Matteo started, but she held up a hand. Let me finish. Please. You deserve the truth. All of it, even the parts that make me look manipulative, or cruel, or psychologically damaged. Yes. I've done this before. Yes, there have been other men I connected with online and then revealed myself to in person. Some ran, some tried and couldn't handle it. Michael, her voice broke. Michael was kind and damaged and tried so hard to be okay with us that it broke something in him. His death wasn't my fault, but it's my responsibility. I carry it every day. She took a shaking breath. And yes, maybe Clara's right that I'm repeating a pattern, trying to control abandonment by staging it, by creating situations where I can predict how and when the person I care about will leave. Maybe it's a compulsion. Maybe it's a coping mechanism. But my feelings for you are real, Matteo. Everything I told you about who I am, what I want, how I see the world, that was real. The only lie was the lie of omission. The only deception was letting you imagine I was simpler than I am. Matteo sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. The woman he'd fallen for online and the woman sitting before him were the same person, but also fundamentally different. One was carefully curated, kept safe in the boundaries of text and voice messages. The other was raw and complicated and came with a history of trauma that extended far beyond her physical condition. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted. I don't know how to reconcile the Emma I thought I knew with this information. I don't know if what I'm feeling is love or manipulation or some combination of both. Then go, Emma said softly. Go back to Spain. Go back to your safe life where relationships are simple and you can leave before things get too real. I won't blame you. I won't even be surprised. It's what everyone does eventually. That's not fair, Matteo protested. None of this is fair. Emma's voice rose, cracking with emotion. It's not fair that I have to choose between being honest and being alone. It's not fair that I can't have a private relationship without my sister being part of it. It's not fair that every person who claims to love me has to love this whole complicated situation, or it doesn't work. It's not fair that Michael died. It's not fair that you found those emails instead of me telling you myself. None of it is fair, Matteo. But this is my life. This is what I have to offer. Take it or leave it, but don't pretend you're the victim here. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Clara's quiet crying, a sound Matteo had never heard before, and it shook him to his core. These weren't just Emma's tears. They were shared, felt in a body that couldn't offer the comfort of physical distance, couldn't separate grief into individual corners. I need time, Matteo finally said. I need to think. Then take time, Emma replied, her voice empty of everything except exhaustion. But take it somewhere else. I can't watch you look at me like I'm a psychological case study. One more second. Matteo went back to his hotel and didn't leave for 2 days. He ordered room service, ignored calls from his friends back in Madrid who wanted to know how the trip was going, and stared at the ceiling, trying to untangle his feelings from his fear. He thought about the pattern Clara had pointed out, his own pattern of running from commitment, of finding reasons to sabotage relationships before they could become real and dangerous, and capable of hurting him. He thought about Michael, a man he'd never met, but who'd become a ghost in this story. A warning about the psychological toll of trying to navigate a relationship that defied every social norm and expectation. He tried to imagine what Michael had felt in those final weeks, what desperation or despair had led him to choose death over the complexity of continuing. He thought about Emma's emails, rereading the screenshots he'd impulsively taken before closing the browser. In them, he saw a woman trapped between her longing for normalcy and her acceptance that normalcy would never be her reality. He saw someone using relationships like experiments, but also someone genuinely searching for connection in the only way she knew how. He saw manipulation, yes, but also profound loneliness and a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. On the third day, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "This is Clara. Emma doesn't know I'm reaching out. She'd kill me if she did. But you deserve some context she won't give you because she's too busy protecting everyone else's feelings, even when they're hurting her." A link followed. Matteo clicked it and found himself looking at a private blog, password protected until Clara had presumably given him access. The entries spanned years, written in Emma's voice but rawer than anything he'd seen in her emails. These were her unfiltered thoughts, her private reckonings with her body, her existence, her place in a world that had no script for how she was supposed to live. He read about their childhood, the surgeries, the medical interventions, the constant assessment by doctors who saw them as a fascinating case rather than as children. He read about their parents' divorce when they were 12, their father unable to handle the stress and financial burden, their mother's descent into alcoholism as she tried to cope with being a single parent to conjoined twins. He read about foster care, about the family that took them in and gave them stability and love, but also made them feel like a charity case, like something to be managed rather than celebrated. He read about Emma's first experience with online connection at 16, discovering that without the visual component, people talked to her like she was just a person. The addictive rush of being seen as normal, as ordinary, as someone whose thoughts mattered more than their body. And he read about the first time she'd revealed herself to someone she'd developed feelings for online, a boy her age who'd immediately blocked her on all platforms, who'd treated her like she was a monster or a prank. "That was the moment," Emma had written, "when I understood that my body would always be the story people told about me, that I could be smart, funny, kind, interesting. None of it mattered once people saw us. The only way to be loved for myself was to separate myself from this body in people's minds before showing them the truth. And even then, even when they claimed to see past it, the body always won in the end. The body always became the reason they left." The entries about Michael were the hardest to read. Emma had genuinely loved him, had believed he was the one who could handle their reality. He'd stayed longer than anyone else, had integrated himself into their lives, had made promises about a future together. But over time, the strain had shown. He'd started drinking. He'd become depressed, unable to reconcile his feelings for Emma with his inability to accept the reality of Clara's constant presence. He'd grown paranoid, convinced that Clara hated him, that she was sabotaging their relationship. The night before Michael died, Emma wrote, "He told me he loved me, but couldn't live in a world where loving me meant living in a fishbowl." He said every intimate moment felt like a performance, that he could never forget Clara was there, that it was driving him insane. He apologized for not being stronger. And then he left. And then he drove into that tree. And then I understood that my need to be loved had killed someone. Matteo set his phone down, his hands shaking. Clara had given him this access not to exonerate Emma, but to show him the weight she carried, the impossible situation she navigated every day. Emma wasn't manipulating people out of cruelty. She was trying to survive in a world that had no place for her, using the only tools she had: intelligence, emotional depth, and the temporary illusion that she could be loved the way normal people were loved. But understanding her motivations didn't solve the fundamental problem. Matteo didn't know if he was capable of being what she needed. He didn't know if anyone was. On the 8th day, Matteo went back to the Victorian house. Emma and Clara were in the backyard, despite the cold, Clara painting on a large canvas, while Emma read aloud from a poetry collection. They looked up when he approached, Emma's face carefully neutral, Clara's expression guarded. "I'm sorry," Matteo said, the words inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry for making you feel like a case study. I'm sorry for running away. And I'm sorry, but I have to be honest, I don't think I can do this." Emma's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes dimmed. Okay. Not because of your body, Matteo continued. Not because you're conjoined. But because I'm not emotionally capable of being in a relationship this complex. I can barely handle normal relationships. I run from commitment. I sabotage things when they get too real. And this, what you're offering, what you need, it's the realest, most demanding kind of love I can imagine. You deserve someone who can meet you there. I'm not that person. At least you're honest, Clara said quietly. That's more than most of them manage. I wish I could be different, Matteo said, and meant it. I wish I was braver, or less damaged, or capable of the kind of courage it would take to build a life with you. Both of you. But I'd just be another Michael, eventually. Another person who tries and fails and leaves wreckage behind. And you've had enough of that. Emma stood. They stood, with the coordination of people who'd been moving together since before birth. She walked over to where Matteo stood and looked him directly in the eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, even for just a few days. Thank you for trying. And thank you for being honest instead of just disappearing. It doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it mean something. She kissed him then, brief and soft, a goodbye that tasted like salt and regret. Clara turned her head away, giving them what privacy she could in a situation that allowed for none. Go, Emma whispered. Before I ask you to stay and we both pretend it could work. Matteo left. He packed his bag at the hotel, changed his flight to leave that night instead of the end of the week, and drove back through the winding Connecticut roads as the sun set behind the trees. He thought about all the ways love could break a person, all the different forms of impossible it could take. At the airport, he sent one final message. You're not a pattern. You're a person trying to survive in an impossible situation. I hope you find someone brave enough to love you the way you deserve. I'm sorry it wasn't me. Emma's response came as he was boarding the plane. Safe travels, Matteo. Thank you for the Spanish wine. We never opened it. I'll save it for someone who stays. The months that followed were harder than Matteo expected. He threw himself into work, took on projects that required all his focus, tried to bury the memory of Emma and Clara under layers of productivity. But late at night, he'd find himself thinking about them, wondering if they were okay, if Emma had found someone else to try her pattern with, if Clara was still painting those violent abstracts. He saw a therapist finally, someone who helped him understand his own patterns, his fear of intimacy, the ways he'd been using emotional unavailability as armor against being hurt. He learned that his inability to commit to Emma wasn't just about their unique situation, it was about his lifelong terror of being truly known and found wanting. 3 months after he left Connecticut, Matteo's phone buzzed with a news alert. He almost ignored it, but something made him click through. The headline felt like a punch to the gut. Conjoined twins make history with controversial separation surgery. His hands shook as he read the article. Emma and Clara had decided to attempt separation, a risky surgery that few conjoined twins survived, especially at their age. The procedure had taken 18 hours. The outcome was uncertain. They were listed in critical condition at Yale New Haven Hospital. Matteo called the hospital immediately, demanded information, was told nothing because he wasn't family. He booked another flight, this time without hesitation, driven by guilt and fear and the belated realization that he'd walked away from something real because it was hard, not because it was impossible. When he arrived at the hospital 2 days later, a woman was sitting in the waiting room who looked like Emma, but also didn't. Thinner, weaker, but alone. Clara was nowhere to be seen. Emma looked up as he approached, and her eyes filled with tears. She didn't make it, Emma said simply. Clara didn't survive the separation. I did. I'm alone now. Just Emma. Just one person. Isn't that what everyone always wanted? Matteo sat beside her, taking her hand. Just her hand. No shared body. No witnessing sister. It should have felt simpler. Instead, it felt like a tragedy beyond measure. Why did you do it? He asked. Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be alone, Emma said. To be just me. To have the possibility of a normal life, normal relationships, normal everything. And because Clara was tired. She'd been tired for years, but she stayed for me. When you left, she told me she was done. Done being the obstacle in my relationships. Done being the reason no one could love me the way I wanted to be loved. Done living. Emma. She planned it, Emma continued, her voice mechanical. She researched surgeons willing to attempt it. She knew the odds. She knew one or both of us would likely die. She chose it anyway. For me. And now I'm alone. And it turns out being alone is worse than anything I imagined. Because I wasn't one person in two bodies. We were two people who made something whole together. And now, half of me is gone, and I don't know how to exist like this. Mateo stayed with her for 2 weeks while she recovered, while she learned to move a body that was suddenly half the weight she'd known her entire life, while she buried Clara in a funeral attended by dozens of medical professionals who'd studied them and a handful of friends who'd actually known them. He stayed because he owed her that, because he'd contributed to the isolation that led to this desperate choice, because he needed to witness the consequence of the world's, of his, inability to accept love in its most complicated forms. But he didn't stay forever. He couldn't. Because even alone, Emma carried the ghost of Clara, the trauma of their separation, the impossible weight of survivor's guilt. And Mateo carried his own inability to be the person someone like Emma needed, someone capable of unconditional acceptance, of love without reservation, of staying when everything in his psychology screamed to run. On his last day in Connecticut, Emma asked him a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Do you think she did it for me? Or because of me? Did she give me a gift, or was it punishment for never being satisfied with what we had? Mateo had no answer. He held Emma while she cried, said goodbye for the second and final time, and returned to Spain carrying the knowledge that some forms of love are too complex for the human heart to hold without breaking. That sometimes the people we fail to love haunt us more permanently than the ones who fail to love us. That deception comes in many forms, but the cruelest might be the lies we tell ourselves about our own capacity for courage. 2 years later, Mateo received a letter. It was postmarked from Oregon, written in handwriting he recognized from the months of online messages before everything fell apart. Emma had moved across the country, was working as a victim's advocate for trauma survivors, had built a life alone that she described as not what I imagined, but mine. I wanted you to know I'm okay, she wrote, or I will be. Grief is long, and learning to be singular after a lifetime of plural is its own kind of language acquisition. But I'm doing it. And I wanted to thank you, strange as that sounds. Thank you for seeing me before you saw us. Thank you for trying, even briefly. Thank you for being honest when you couldn't stay. And thank you for coming back, even though it was too late. All of it mattered. All of it was real. She ended the letter with a line that Clara used to say, a quote from some physicist whose name Emma couldn't remember. In the end, we're all just star matter trying to understand itself. Some of us are binary stars, and when one goes supernova, the other is changed forever. But we're still made of the same essential light. Mateo kept the letter in his desk drawer. He never responded, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood that some connections are meant to exist in memory rather than continuation. That the purpose of some people in our lives is to show us our limitations so we can work to expand them for whoever comes next. He thought about Emma often, about Clara, about the impossible situation they'd been born into and the impossible choice that ended it. He thought about Michael and the other men before him, and wondered if any of them carried the same weight he did, the same knowledge that they'd been offered something rare and real and had been too afraid to accept it. In his nightmares, he dreamed of the Victorian house, of Emma and Clara moving through it with practiced grace, of the life they'd built in the margins of a world that had no place for them. And in his dreams, he made a different choice. He stayed. He learned. He loved them, both of them, the way they deserved. But when he woke, he was always alone, in his Madrid apartment overlooking Retiro Park, the city stretching out below him, full of people living simpler lives, carrying lighter burdens, loving in ways that fit neatly into society's prescribed narratives. And he understood, finally, that the real deception hadn't been Emma hiding her body. It had been both of them hiding their hearts, Emma behind the protective shield of her condition, and Matteo behind the armor of his emotional unavailability. Two people afraid of being truly known, circling each other through screens and carefully curated revelations, building something that looked like love, but was really just two brands of loneliness recognizing each other across the void. The story didn't end with murder, or dramatic confession, or criminal justice. It ended the way most tragedies end, with people surviving, barely, carrying wounds that would never fully heal, learning to live with the weight of choices made and not made, of love offered and refused, of the unbridgeable gap between wanting to be better and actually being brave enough to change. Emma lived. Matteo lived. Clara was gone. And somewhere in the space between those facts lay the truth about what we owe each other, what we're capable of bearing, and what we destroy in ourselves and others when we choose safety over the terrifying vulnerability of real connection. The Star Matter continued trying to understand itself, one failure at a time.